Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner, Head of Collections at the Library of Michigan, talking today with one of our Michigan notable book authors, Lexie Bean, author of The Ship We Built. Lexie, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm
Good to
happy
see
to
you.
spend time with you.
And so just to get into the meat of the matter, Lexie, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself, your background, and how or why did you become a writer?
Sure. Um, I'll start by saying that I did not think I was going to be an author when I was growing up.
Okay.
I was pretty afraid of my words. Um, I grew up in a setting similar to Rowan, the main character in the book, where I felt really far away from myself at times and often experienced different kinds of not safe. Um, and so for me, I thought, oh, if I wrote things down, I had to get in trouble, or maybe my thoughts aren't very good. And even when I went to college, eventually I avoided writing classes. I was afraid of them saying, no, you can't be here.
All right.
This book writing process was definitely a good accident. I wrote the very first draft as a gift for a friend,
Really?
somebody who someone who I was texting with, and they said to me that you should write a children's book. And I really liked this person, and I wanted them to like me. Um, but also I had the kind of feelings where like they felt like a muse. So later that day, I wrote the first draft, and in my mind, it was just going to be something that they would see. Um, and it was more of like a little poem or like a picture book.
Yeah.
And then over the course of about 6 years, it became a novel. I became obsessed with the characters and kept revisiting it.
So this
And
person, your muse at the time, did they
yeah.
um did they push you? Did they say, "Hey, Lexi, you know what? You should like flesh this out some more," or was it just you who was at home one day saying, "You know what? I need to add more to this."
They did not push me. I mean, in the sense, yes, like they said that they enjoyed it and it was dear to them, and that sort of sun and water on something that felt precious, felt good. Um, so I guess maybe less of a push and more of a nurture, a nurturing. And but I've continued on it just in my own time, mostly when I was in cars, or if I was on a train. There's something
Okay.
about like being in transit, being nowhere
Uh-huh.
or in between spaces, kind of allowed me to explore in a way that I don't always make time for in my everyday life.
Very nice. And so
I
when you
try
say,
to now, but I didn't then.
and if I may say, I mean, you live in New York City, so do you find yourself writing on the subways? Do you find yourself writing on the commuter trains at all? Or is that something you still do?
Sometimes, sometimes it was mostly it's before I lived where I live now, so it was like yeah, getting rides to places. I was moving around a lot um,
So
at the
what was that?
time.
I mean, so you
For a
you had
while, I
this,
was living in Hungary.
and I'm sorry, there's a lag between us. If it gets
Oh, it's
really bad,
okay.
no, 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 it's not you. It's weird when it comes up. Um, and if it gets too bad, I'll probably stop us and maybe ask if we can reschedule when the time seems better with the connectivity. And it's only because if the lag gets really bad, the interview gets jagged. And we can edit this all out, so it's not a big deal. But let me ask you this: when you talk about, that I I mean, I guess I would describe it as apprehension of writing. What
Mhm.
made you feel like you had to write after? you had done this first draft? Like, was it just, the story's got to come out, I got to get this out of me? I mean, what was that? What was that feeling for you?
It felt like, especially the narrator, I felt like the world was always continuing in my brain, and the writing process didn't really feel like writing. It felt like knocking on a little door and being like, what's happened since the last time I was here?
Oh, wow.
I immediately saw the narrator as a full person who was afraid to trust. And so in writing this over 6 years, I I think that in some ways it had taken time for that person to trust me to transcribe.
That's a really interesting one. So describe the narrator for us. Describe who that is.
Yeah, the narrator is a 10-year-old boy um, who would probably now be considered a trans boy, but as it takes place in the late 90s, that language doesn't quite exist in the same way,
Sure.
which is both like a good thing and a bad thing. Sometimes there's something very freeing about not having language because then it could be anything, and there's not ideas of what you have to be to be considered real as a
Yeah.
certain identity. Um, it's less of a list of check marks. Where also having language can allow community in a different way. But yeah, so it takes place in the 90s, late 90s, and he loves water.
Mhm.
He writes letters and attaches them to balloons as a way to send his thoughts far away. At first to make a friend, and then later to, I would say, later it becomes more of a prayer process or just letting go of whatever he's feeling and being willing to write it down even when it's hard or he feels like he's not saying something right. So making the decision to write it anyways is really brave. So
So let me ask, I
what?
mean, that trust building process between you and the 10-year-old, I mean, what was that like? I mean, what, how can I put this? How did you feel like it was a building trust between you and the narrator? Like when, you know, were there moments when you felt like, yep, we've crossed this wall? And I know I'm talking like the narrator is a wholly different person, but do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to ask you? I mean, it's a very
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
concept because I've never thought about it that way before. So please go ahead. You're the subject, not me.
um, that's a good, interesting question. No one's asked before, so thank you.
Oh, that's all right.
Um, I would say so the very, very first draft, I like I mentioned, was like a picture book. Um, and so everything that was in the picture book version ended up being in the final version, but expanded on. Um, and there were a lot of things being alluded to in the first one that weren't spelled out. So, for example, there are no parent figures in the picture book version,
Right.
but it's like he wasn't ready to talk about his family. Um, or there was a scene where he talks about his body. He talks about imagining his belly button as a blowhole for a whale that lives in his bloodstream.
Hmm.
And that gets heavily expanded on too in the text of his relationship with his body and trying to make sense of the ways that it's changing, being 10, but also it feeling out of his control in other ways. because of external forces.
Sure.
I also came out as trans alongside writing with Rowan.
Okay.
He came out as trans before I did. And it sort of helped me see myself by listening.
Nice. So let me ask you this. So, I mean, the audience, I mean, did you even have an audience in mind or, for that matter, did Rowan even have an audience in mind? Was there, going to be an audience in your mind at all,
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like in terms of Rowan, I would say his initial audience, yeah, is whoever finds he's a balloon, ideally a new friend, someone he doesn't really have to explain himself to. And then in time, for him, I think the audience is not necessarily another person. But if it is another person, he doesn't need them as badly as he does in the beginning.
Gotcha. Okay.
Um, and in some ways, in some moments, I think he thinks of the balloon recipient as like maybe God, or like this, gets to a point where who's writing back? Like,
Yeah. I mean, hence your idea about prayers, right? I mean, that, yeah.
yeah. And all the while he experiences doubt about religion or like
Sure.
doubt about faith. And so that's I think an interesting like through line of the text for me as the writer. Yeah, the original audience was one person, and whoever was in the car with me at the time I wrote it.
Were you
um
reading it to them when you were writing in the car? Were you reading it to those people?
I read it to those people afterwards. Yeah.
Did you? Cool. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, they were very sweet about it. I'm grateful for that.
Nice.
I think one of them might have been sleeping, but I think the rest of them were listening.
Car
um,
rides affect all of us differently, right?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then each draft, I would say, like the audience expanded, and I think that's really good. And I think that's in some ways writing advice I have for people, especially people who are writing proximate to their own experiences that have caused trauma or reckoning of relationships or their body, um, is to start, for me, the very first drafts are just for like me and another person, um, because I think that allowed me to be as vulnerable as I could be in the sharing.
Sure.
Where
So,
if I immediately started with being like, this is going to be a novel and everyone's going to read it, I wouldn't even start, honestly.
yeah.
Like that would scare me. That would really scare me. Or I would maybe start, but I would either wouldn't finish or I would just like stay on the surface about things, thinking about everyone who's going to be reading it or may read it if it's accessible to them. And then so the drafts after that, like the next ones were like, this is like for people in this like email thread that I belong to. And then like the drafts after that were like, this is for like for like people who like grew up with me. So like basically each round expanded to the point where much later versions of the book, I started thinking about like kind of going back to individuals again, or going back to like types of like this next revision. I'm going to be thinking about like the popular girls I went to school with, or like in this next revision, I'm going to think about like my teachers, like, yeah. And so it's kind of like a tapestry in that way.
That's fantastic. So let me ask you this. I mean, you're dealing with a highly vulnerable original work, did you have any inspiration to draw upon? I mean, obviously, maybe some of your own personal experiences, but I mean, were there works that you could say, you know what, I kind of want it to be like this? You know,
Mhm.
I mean, or authors or anything like that at all? Or was there maybe a movie, anything? I mean, what were you drawing on?
Yeah, I love that question. A lot of it was personal experience, things
Mhm.
from childhood and things from adulthood, rearranged. But in terms of other works that inspired me, The Little Prince was one.
Nice.
One of the earliest drafts I wrote, I thought it was going to be kind of similar to that, where it'd be like 80 pages, a lot of illustrations, and like
Mhm.
loosely connected tales that it's kind of ethereal. Like, yeah, there was a version of this book that was very much inspired by that. Um, I was also really inspired by, I've lived in Hungary a few different times. And one time I was walking down the street in Budapest, and there's this book being sold for very cheap in a box, and it's called Altatu, which means sleeping pill, which is like it's like a lullaby.
Okay.
Um, and my Hungarian is not very good at all, but it was like I could get through that book, and just the illustrations were so beautiful and just made me think a lot about like connecting dream and reality and how
Mm.
like that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Mhm.
Where I think growing up and having my own forms of like PTSD, I always thought of it as a bad thing. For too long I thought of it as like a purely bad thing of like, oh, something that doesn't allow someone to be fully present. But I also just like seeing this book and reflecting more on my own experience and my own future, it just made me think, oh, like I actually survival can come from taking a break from the present. Um,
Okay.
and that's also like my body's way of believing that like better worlds or other worlds exist. And that's very wise and interesting. But yeah, so sleeping pill was a big inspiration for me.
Okay.
Um, and um, I would say Pixar movies in general were a big inspiration for me because I'm really moved by how they do a really good job of making something that's for kids but is secretly for adults,
Sure.
or not always so secretly. But I I remember as I was like once I hit my late teens and early 20s, I found it so interesting that a lot of my friends or people that I was meeting would say that a Pixar movie had made them cry, or they felt like the depth of like a certain montage in a kid's film.
Hmm.
And I very much like wanted to draw from that. I think especially writing the LGBTQ
Describe that
book.
if you could in the book. I mean, like, how would you say you wrote it for children, but were able to secretly write it for adults? I mean, is there an example you could give our viewers?
um, Let me try. Well, I think there's a lot of like simple. Hang on, there's my cat's on the counter, and I don't want to.
It's okay. I have two cats. It's all right.
Okay, that worked. That's funny.
It's all right. I have two cats. I have to close my door for my two
um,
cats.
I think what comes to mind to me right away, um, is there's a lot of direct questions in the text because they're all letters,
Mhm.
and I think there are questions in the text that can make an adult slow down, um, as
Okay.
well as a kid slow down. And one of the reasons I put questions in the text is because I want the reader to humanize the author not the oh actually the author too, but the author of the letters, Rowan, as much as possible, especially as yeah, he's a young trans boy, where there's a lot of unnecessary contention around that fact, that making room for him to basically ask for a relationship by asking questions feels important to me. I also think there are just like the stress of like small moments and the impact of small movements as a young person is like pretty profound, in a way that sometimes only adults will recognize. Because when you're a kid, it's you don't always have that like the ability to look back in the same way, because you're not given distance or you're not given time.
Sure.
Where like yeah, someone stepping on my favorite pencil in like this in elementary school was like really scary and big for whatever reason. Like it's just like one of those things that just stays. And as an adult, you know what has stayed, whether it's out of necessity or whether it's out of like projecting it onto other experiences, or whether it's I don't know, like grappling with different themes of like forgiveness in life. Yeah, there's a lot there. And also, so the book also deals with themes of abuse at home. And the truth is, a lot of people don't know that they're survivors until well into their adulthood, because they've had to normalize in order to get through. And so I was also keeping that audience in mind, of like people who are coming to terms with their past at different rates. And I think that's also very true for LGBTQ people in general too. Like there's always different ways of facing the past in a way that's both reclamation but also really tough.
You talk about two themes. I was very interested when you talked about, young people being able to, I don't want to state it this way, but dwell on the small moments or think about the small moments in a way that maybe an adult doesn't. I mean, it's almost like a meditation in a way, isn't it? I mean, it's, meditative state. So when you talk about, I mean, did you view this book for yourself as a writer as reclaiming your past almost in a way, or maybe like, I hate to put it this way, but claiming victory, if you will, I don't know. I'm just trying to put it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say it definitely helped me. It was also very hard. I would say the writing part definitely helped me. The releasing part has been harder.
The releasing part?
Yeah, like the book coming out and like navigating all of the things that come with the more bureaucratic ends of the publishing process have been more challenging.
Describe that. What would be some of the bureaucracy you've had to face?
I understand where it comes from. But yeah, I think there are certain things that every author has to deal with in terms of like having to pinpoint what age something is for. For example, like I definitely had an adult audience in mind when I wrote this, but also a young audience too. But when it comes to the bureaucracy, there's it's much more categorical.
Sure.
Where there's this idea of something is for a certain kind of people, and if it's for other people that aren't in that group, it could be confusing. um, and yeah, or I think also, honestly, like ideas of what's age appropriate. Like, I'm a pretty firm believer that anything kids experience, like that topic should be made to be age appropriate, because the decision to not talk about it puts the young person in a position of having to raise themselves.
Mm.
And that's unfair and
Mhm.
sometimes unsafe. So that's definitely been on my mind as someone who wrote both about like elements of abuse, but also, yeah, other things like a little bit about addiction, a little bit about faith. These themes that are considered YA.
Right.
But for middle grade readers, it's like they're really smart. They're like kids, young people are really smart. I think if a kid is emotionally sophisticated enough to want to disappear, like then they can feel deeply and they can understand their environments and not understand their environments in very deep ways.
Mm.
And yeah, so there's definitely in a marketing process, like, you know, it's it's tough. I think one of the big things that has come to the forefront for me is especially for trans narratives, there's a pressure to have no trauma, like, you know, at the end, like everything is like everyone's getting along.
It's all sewn up.
And it's like, yeah, it's all sewn up, exactly.
Right, right.
And nothing is that bad. Um, or the opposite happens where there's an expectation to have like trauma, 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 almost as a tool to humanize the person, even if it's like good intention, like that shouldn't be a tool to humanize somebody either. Where I believe I went somewhere in between, like something more nuanced and based off of experience. So that in some ways I know makes it less marketable. Um,
Can I ask that then? I mean, how was it? How was it to get a publisher interested? I mean, how? I mean, what? Right? I mean, because they do have definitive boundaries. They have market audiences. I mean, was that was that
yeah,
difficult? I mean,
yeah. Well, in the earlier versions, some of the things that were more controversial weren't quite as I wouldn't even say explicit because I would say the final text isn't explicit either. But it was less to the forefront in some of the earlier drafts. But I knew it was there, like as the author and as someone who had already spent at that point like several years with the narrator. So consequently, we just had many, many conversations afterwards. One of the things that was sort of a compromise, that I'm ultimately glad that it exists in the book, was I wrote like an author's note at the end,
mhm.
where I speak more directly to what's going on. And hopefully that offers a guide for readers who,
How was that a compromise?
because so there's this narrative, it's like a very yucky narrative,
Mhm.
that especially now with so much anti-trans legislation,
Sure.
that like people are trans because they were abused, and if someone comes out as trans, it's an indication of child abuse.
Mm.
um, it's a very toxic narrative, and I have received that several times. And so there's concern from me and also people from the publishing end, that a reader might interpret the text, because I'm speaking on both issues at the same time. People might interpret the text as that. And I believe, and what I have realized is, people who really, really believe that, people who really believe it's that simple of a cause and effect, they're going to find any sort of issue. I could have taken out the abuse parts, and they would have been like, oh, well, this person is trans because like this other bad thing happened, or like because they had this like they would find another cause and effect way to label what went wrong. So and then I also believe, and I say this in the author's note, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what anything comes from. The point is to respect people for what they're saying in that moment.
Right.
And getting lost and finding a source is just an indication that you think that that thing is bad, that you think the result is bad. So yeah, so that's how that was a compromise, was basically like holding the audience's hand a little bit more and breaking it down for people.
So was that an ongoing discussion you had with the publisher at one time?
Mm-hmm.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
I mean,
I am very happy with how.
I would imagine that would have been a very difficult process overall. Am I correct?
Yeah. For me emotionally it was, just because it's so personal, and I've had bad experiences in the past with like related conversations of like getting to the bottom of somebody's identity in a toxic way, that yeah, I felt very protective of the narrator, but at the end I feel really happy with how the book came out, and yeah, I'm happy with how it came out. It's been an interesting process.
Fantastic.
But
So
I'm glad that they were willing to have, those conversations, as opposed to just being like, no. That's huge.
yeah, no, that is huge. What did it mean to you to have your book selected as a Michigan Notable Book?
I was very excited because, oh gosh, a few reasons. One is because a lot of LGBTQ community I know from growing up in Michigan has had it really hard. Yeah. Many of them have wanted to die. Many of them have navigated different layers of addiction or houselessness. And it's so normal. And so to offer a resource for people who are navigating those different themes, that means the world to me. Also because I've thought about this, especially since leaving Michigan, like how real regionalism is. I didn't know as much when I was just, there all the time, because, I don't have a full awareness of how other people are looking at us. But especially with the past few presidential elections, and ideas of what certain parts of the country are like, or what they can be, felt very toxic. So I was also very excited to explore those themes of being looked at but also the real impact of like industry loss and what that does to people's sense of self,
Hmm.
and addiction. And so it means, yeah, so it means a lot for all those reasons too. Also because as an extension of that narrative, there's the assumption that, if you're queer in a place like Michigan, you must have like a horrible life unless you're like in Ann Arbor or something. But that's not necessarily true. Like, and I wanted to poke at that in this text. There are definitely some serious challenges that I hope will be eased for future generations and current generations.
Hmm.
But there are also some really wonderful things too that I haven't actually found in other places, such as the sense of actually needing each other.
You find that in Michigan?
Yeah, I found that amongst like my LGBTQ community that I have made in Michigan. Yeah, there's less of a disposability, where in New York, I feel like because there are so many like LGBTQ people, and it's more of like a bit like a go environment.
Hmm.
And it's also kind of removed in a lot of ways. It sometimes feels like its own country. I Yeah, I think there's more of a feeling of disposability amongst um, individuals in our community in a way that I had never felt in Michigan.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah, because it's like, oh, you can always just find another one, or like, yeah,
Right. Well, interesting. Well, thank you, Lexie.
yeah.
Thank you for being with us today. And let me ask, is there another book in the future?
Good one. Yeah, there's a few things that are like turning for me. I wrote a screenplay version of The Ship We Built,
Oh,
and
fantastic.
yeah, I actually worked on it while writing the novel. Sort of worked on them at the same time, but
Hmm.
at first it was kind of more of a thought experiment, because it helped me to just sort of figure out dialogue and what's happening outside of the narrator's brain.
Sure.
But yeah, I finished a draft of that, and I'm working with an agent for it to hopefully find a creative team. We'll see what happens, but I hope it works out.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you. And I'm in early stages on another book that would be set in Michigan. Um, um, that's also pretty personal. It's an idea I've had for a long time, and I've only started really sitting with it over the past year. And it feels good to sit with something after thinking about it for a long time, um, and becoming the person that I need to be to write it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. We look forward to seeing it. And thank you for
Yeah.
being with us today. Lexie Bean's book, The Ship We Built. Lexie, thank you for being here today. Thank you for being with us, and have a wonderful day.